Today, David Cameron gets a letter from Tory backbenchers demanding that he take back control of more than 100 laws from the EU. Just another little shred of news in the ongoing world of Westminster, except that it speaks to a wider sense of unease on the Conservative side of politics, which was summed up by yesterday's Sunday Telegraph. That said that in his eagerness for popularity, the Prime Minister runs the risk of turning his back on the fundamental values of the party he leads. Current areas of concern include the environment, there's a lot of hostility to wind farms, Europe, foreign aid, anti-business rhetoric and much else. Well, today we're going to ask what those fundamental values are, or should be, for British Conservatives. I'm joined by the modernising Tory MP Margot James, the Conservative columnist Peter Hitchens, Conservative but not exactly a loyal foot soldier, I think it's fair to say, the author of Pity the Billionaire Thomas Frank, who's been analysing the Tea Party insurgency on the American right, and the champion of British neoconservatism, Douglas Murray. Let's start with you, Douglas, because ideology is a good place to begin, and the mere question of whether British Conservatives should have a coherent ideology is something that Conservatives argue about.
Absolutely. Conservatism itself, you could argue, is an anti-ideological ideology. It doesn't want to engage in the doctrines that the left, for instance, engages in. However, I would argue that the right, Conservatives, have to have a defined ideology, not least in recent decades, because the onslaught from the left has been so intense and so far-reaching in its consequences that you cannot rebut it solely by non-ideology alone.
And that means that if you are somebody like David Cameron at the helm, you need kind of strong underpinnings to ensure that you're not just buffeted by events.
I think you'd need to know where you're coming from.
And so, in its essence, neoconservatism for a British audience means what?
Well, neoconservatism is simply a brand of conservatism, but which is propelled by the desire to conserve, and in neoconservatism's case would also believe in certain situations, such as foreign affairs, being rather more proactive, perhaps, than traditional small-c conservatism.
Peter Hitchens, you would regard yourself... You called yourself in the past a paleo-conservative rather than a neo-conservative.
Well,
paleo meaning old, but I mean...
People call me that. It's not. It's just a term to try and distinguish myself, apart from anything else, from Douglas and his mad foreign adventures that he's so strangely keen on. But it is really just, I'm a conservative. That is to say, I don't believe that all progress is good, that I believe many things which now exist deserve to be preserved, and that some things which used to exist ought to be restored. And I have a fairly sound basis for that belief in experience and in a very, very strong love of my own country, which I see now very sorely distressed. And that's where my conservatism comes from.
And what about ideology? Would you go back to a body of writing, philosophical writing or other writing, and say this is sort of ideologically where I come from, or is it all instinctive?
No, I think the foundation of conservatism does come from Christianity, but that is not an ideology. It's a religion, and amongst other things, it limits the ambitions of man. It says that God's kingdom is not of this world, and utopias are always wrong. The problem is that, as Douglas rightly said, we confront utopians all the time, and especially since the end of the 19th century, when Fabianism became a very strong strand in English politics, and then since the Second World War, when the sort of cultural Marxism of the 1960s revolution moved into radical politics. If you don't understand your enemy, and if you don't understand what it is that he's seeking to do, you won't be able to combat him. And an awful lot of conservatism is simply a machine for obtaining office for the sons of gentlemen, rather than a party which looks at the country and says, this is what's wrong with it, this is what needs to be put right, and this is what we could do better.
Let's turn to a daughter of gentlemen who's successfully sought office under the Conservative machine. Margot James, does ideology matter to you? Do you think it's an important thing to be talking about for Conservatives?
I don't think ideology is at the root of conservatism, in that Marxism might be said to be at the root of socialism, which is a pretty rigid framework of an ideology. Conservatism I would define more as a philosophy, and I think it has its roots in the philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, Burke and Mill, and then more recently, when, fast forwarding really to the 1960s and 70s, when Britain was the sick man of Europe economically, there was a big need to save the country, and the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher then looked to a basis of action which had its roots more in a sense of economic freedom.
Small state and smaller state.
Exactly.
Yeah. Giving an American perspective, Thomas Frank, you've been looking at the Tea Party insurgency, I called it, but the phenomenon on the right that after a period of economic crisis caused by the failure of regulation and greed in the banking sector and all the rest of it, so many Americans turn not to social democratic or leftish solutions, but to conservative ones.
That's right. And first of all, thanks for having me here. And, you know, I'm listening to your descriptions of the UK, and I would say that in America, the situation is precisely the reverse. There really isn't any kind of left in the way that you guys are describing the left here in the United States. But you do have on the right, you have a movement that is, you know, powerfully ideological. And the ideology in that case, I mean, they call themselves conservative, whether they, you know, neocon or paleocon, I don't know. The ideology is the market. Now, this is fascinating in all sorts of ways. First of all, the sort of utopian hold, the grip that it has on the minds of the leaders of the American right. I'm reminded of a speech that Rick Santorum gave the other day. This is the guy, a former senator from Pennsylvania, who's running for the presidency in the Republican Party, where he said something that was absolutely contrary to what we know to be true about the world we live in, which is he's talking about the financial crisis, the housing bubble of 2008 and before. And he says, we know what caused that. Government forced banks to hand out bad loans to poor people. Okay, this is, as a matter of fact, not true. It's very well established that it's not true. But he says, we know this is the case. We don't, and what he means by that is, we don't really need to look any further because our ideology explains the situation to us, okay? We know that markets always work, and that if you just get government out of the way, everything's going to be fine. And the other thing I want to point out about this is that this is a profoundly unconservative ideology. There's nothing more destructive of, you know, inherited traditions than, you know, the free operations of the market.
I'd like to pick up directly on the market and look at what's happened to this country over the last few years, where we did have many people would say an under-regulated financial system, and we now have a far bigger gap between a few people earning vast amounts of money right at the top, and the controversy at the moment about what bank bosses and others are being paid, and the average wage. Now, what I want to see is whether there is a distinction made among the Conservatives around the table as to whether this is virtuous, the market acting in a virtuous way, or whether there is indeed something anti-conservative about that. Peter.
Well, it's extraordinary, the confusion which has happened. It happened in the era of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, particularly among political conservatives, who seemed to think that the market was a substitute for Christianity, that somehow or other was this force, the invisible hand, that would, if left to its own devices, create a good society. These people were completely uninterested in matters of morals and culture, and completely uninterested, it seemed to me, in preserving the particularity and independence of their own countries, and mistook 19th century liberalism for conservatism. And from that grave mistake, an awful lot has followed. I have anything whatsoever in common with almost anything that Margot has said. And I look at outfits like the Tea Party in the United States, and I have nothing in common with them. They don't have any interest in the things that interest me, which are, as I say, in preserving culture, in preserving and extending morality and such things as the family and the small particular things of life in which people can be free. And this is nothing whatever to do with conservatism, and it's a perversion of the cause, which has almost completely destroyed it as a political force in both the United States and in Britain.
You are a liberal, small L, Margot, not a conservative. Question.
Certainly not, no. I think that perhaps I have much more in common with some of the things that Peter wants to conserve than he thinks I have. I think virtually all my colleagues in the Conservative Party, whether in Parliament or not, see the preservation of our civic institutions and the role of the monarchy and the family as absolutely paramount. I don't think that the market has replaced conservatism. I think the market is crucial in terms of rewarding people for hard work and enterprise, which is a central tenet of conservatism. But it is certainly not the only thing. I mean, the very word conservative derives from conserve, and we are just as much about conserving as we are about innovating.
But there is a great wrenching happening, isn't there, at the moment, between the demands of the global market, we are told, where you don't get people to run big businesses or big banks unless they're paid vast rewards, and the anger, the resentment, the disappointment felt by millions and millions of, as it were, culturally conservative people rooted in countries like this one, who see them, disappearing into a kind of parallel world. And the question, in the end, whose side are you on in that struggle? Can't be avoided.
Well, I think that it is not a new problem, Andrew. I can remember back in the 70s, it was the same. I would say that there is a slight creeping return of the politics of envy, which concerns me greatly. Yes, some of these salaries are absolutely remote from all of us around this table, I would imagine, and certainly average salary, people on average salaries. But I mean, one of the main changes since those days of the 70s has been the globalisation of many industries. And we do have to have an eye to the preservation of jobs in this country. And if we go too far out on a limb in taxing those large salaries, as the Labour Party is suggesting at the moment,
you just lose the company.
I fear that very much.
You're a millionaire because you built your own company, aren't you? I mean, I should say you're not a millionaire because somebody has paid you huge sums of money to sit on boards and mess up companies, because you built your own ones.
That is true, and I sometimes reflect that it probably it took me about 15 years to build my business before I sold it, and it took me 15 years to earn what one of these bankers earns in a year or two. I have no resentment of that. I didn't have the sort of financial brain to go into banking. Neither did I want to sell my soul to a corporate institution, which is what it takes at that level of that industry. They are on tap 16 to 18 hours a day, Christmas Day, whatever. They have to sacrifice their entire lives for it.
No time.
And it would not be my choice of a way to live, and I would prefer a way to live which is perhaps less financially remunerative.
Douglas Murray.
And one of the things that used to be said by some conservatives here and in America after the Cold War was that the right had won the economic conflict and that the left had won the culture wars. And actually this boast, half boast as it were, has come back to bite those conservatives who argued it, because there's no doubt that, I think wrongly, the right has been saddled with the mistakes that have gone on in recent years, have been to a large extent blamed for excesses within the market that we have seen both in America and in the UK. And I think that's a serious problem that conservatism is going to have to get over. And it's going to have to be a culture war, as it were, that it's going to have to fight itself. I just wanted to put in one other as it were, pillar of conservatism which is worth discussing, which is the issue of institutions. The idea that the market is the institution, that the market will do, that's enough, is of course a terrible mistake. Societies, and conservative societies, are made up partly by their reliance on a whole range of institutions, the rule of law, the law courts, the monarchy in the case of Britain, a parliament, a working parliament that actually does the job that parliament is meant to do. All of these things which, if you actually look at Britain in particular today, you can't help but come to the conclusion that at the very least all of these institutions have been significantly debased, and at the root of that is, I think, the reason why some people end up relying on the idea that only one institution, the market, can take us out of this malaise.
Is there a